Fellow graduates, teachers, parents, and honored guests, we as Americans, and particularly those of us living in places as diverse as the Bay Area, enjoy something that most other people in the world do not. We live in close proximity to people who are different, in some cases very different from ourselves. And this closeness seems natural. From virtually our first history lesson, we are taught that America is a melting pot, a place where cultures have converged and mingled in an equal manner, preserving traditions while blending new Americans into a society that has room for everyone. But the idea of America as a melting pot has been confounded in recent years by the increasingly tribal mentality of some of its inhabitants. As documented by Bill Bishop, a researcher at the University of Texas at Austin, a highly mobile generation of Americans has gradually sorted itself into virtually homogeneous blocks. Today, people who live next to each other are more likely to look, think, behave, and vote similarly than ever before. It's ironic because in recent years, voters have come to protest something called gerrymandering, in which politicians draw legislative districts to maximize one party or one ethnic group, because it engenders political extremism by rewarding the politicians that cater to the most partisan voters. And it's ironic because Americans over the years have been steadily making this process easier by essentially forming communities around people with whom they agree, and actually reinforcing their own beliefs and steadily becoming more extreme in the process. And the insularity that this self-segregation has produced has had, I'm sorry to say, an especially profound impact on children who grow up believing that our community's peculiarities and subcultures are normal, or at least not far out of the mainstream, and perpetuating their isolation. And it's important to note this trend is not unusual in and of itself. America has always played host to communities that choose to remain apart, although the vast majority of them have tended to integrate themselves after a generation or two, because children who grow up speaking English and considering themselves American tend to blend in better than their parents. Rather, it is the means by which these separate communities are forming, fragmentation rather than immigration, that is alarming. And this phenomenon is not limited to one region or one class or one ethnicity. It is, for all intents and purposes, universal. There is reason to believe, furthermore, that the process is likely to accelerate, because in previous great migrations, most notably the white flight that made America's inner cities virtually an exclusive province of minorities, it is always those who resist the longest who ultimately feel the strongest pressure to conform. We arrive then at a simple question: is this fragmentation necessarily a negative development? And there are certainly those who don't think that it's negative in the least, or who at least think that it is so inexorable a trend that we are better off learning to adapt to it than attempting to resist it. If we accept the theories that, for example, Juan Enriquez laid out in his book, The Untied States of America, the cultural divides between America's regions are leading to centrifugal forces that are too strong to ignore. The premise of this theory is undoubtedly correct. Regionalism has always been a powerful force in American culture and politics, as I'm sure all of us learned under Mr. Scheel. The Civil War arose because North and the South had much broader cultural divides than just over whether America should allow slavery or be a free soil country. But in the past, America has coped with regionalism without breaking the Union, except, of course, in the one example. And on some level, a common American identity, a pride in being American, has always bound our disparate factions together. But today, there are some unique fragmenting factors that are in play. Multiculturalism, for example, receives unparalleled accommodations at all levels. With bilingual education for children, ethnic businesses and communities for adults, and even multilingual government services, it is now possible to grow up in America and to participate in virtually all the duties and responsibilities of a citizen without having acquired a functional command of English. And since English is America's lingua franca, ethnic communities no longer face the same pressures towards integration that they once did. And with even so-called model minorities forming self-sustaining clusters, which are frankly just a connotation away from being bona fide ghettos, who can blame them? It is and always has been easier to settle around one's countrymen, especially when the alternative is tempered with a caustic dose of xenophobia. It's just that today, those countrymen are all too often the people whose ancestors came over on the same boat, not the unhyphenated Americans. And partisan political divides, too, have become, by any standard, more acerbic. I mentioned gerrymandering earlier, and that's just one symptom of a greater problem. It seems often like quite a few Americans are content to only be proud of their country when they like the president. And the 24-hour news cycle, and along with that, the declining national attention span, have created a media climate in which cutthroat competition for the latest attention-grabbing headline has led to an expectation, it sometimes seems, that national leaders be not only puritanical but also clairvoyant. And meanwhile, special interest groups have hijacked the institutions and processes that were meant to safeguard the public will. And substantive policy debate, the kind of thing that enables us to be good citizens and participants in the great task of governing our country, has been reduced wherever possible to a string of meaningless ad hominem attacks, transforming complex political questions into black and white, good and evil, us versus them dichotomies, in which the opposition is demonized and compromise of any kind is simply inadmissible. But despite these extraordinary structural forces, simply allowing the disintegration of America into inward-looking, conformist, self-reinforcing tribes that seem to have difficulty believing that they all share a common language, let alone a common country, is not an option. Half a century after the walls of institutional racial segregation finally began to come down, it is unacceptable that the goal of broader societal integration should be so carelessly tossed aside. Rather, we, you and I, the class of 2009, an entire generation, the first to grow up in these seemingly fragmented communities, are called upon to reassert the unity of our nation, to rediscover our sense of common purpose in those essential American values of patriotism and hard work. We cannot undo what previous generations have done, or at least not easily, but we can seek to recapture the dream of integration through a new American identity and a new American ethos. Why must we do this? Because today, American values of freedom and tolerance are under siege. Authoritarian regimes, once pronounced dead in an era of liberal democracy, have returned, as enslaved peoples have made a Faustian pact to sell their freedom for prosperity. And all over the world, people have taken our fragmenting impulses a step further and dared to imagine not only homogeneous communities, but an entirely pure, intolerant, conformist world. But fundamentally, I believe that Americans are an exceptional people. We inhabit one of the last continents to be settled by humans, and then subsequently resettled in one of history's greatest migrations. Every one of our ancestors, every one to a man, came here because they were looking for a better life, and they were willing to work hard to improve their lot. Ours is the only human community that can boast such origins and such accomplishments. And I believe that these commonalities are more powerful than any temporary language barrier, any racial divide, any difference of opinion. Only through them can we once again become one nation with one purpose. And through our unity, we may yet preserve a world for diversity. A world safe for diversity, sorry. This is not to say that we should become bland conformists ourselves. If anything, as I look upon you, the class of 2009, and all the other wonderful people that are gathered here today, you have shown us all that a group of diverse individuals can share a powerful bond of community. But we are, I believe, the exception here at Pinewood, not the rule. As Mr. Riches said earlier, Pinewood is the difference. And as we embark in this next great journey of ours, we will be called upon to once again form these bonds of community in a way that will allow us to be functionally unified. Because it is only through unity that we can find strength, and only through strength that we can safeguard freedom. Thank you all, and God bless.